Jim Harper never believed the stories about Harmon Road. He grew up in Lancaster, Columbia County, and moved to this godforsaken corner of West Virginia only because the bank offered a mortgage he couldn't refuse. The house was a steal. A large Victorian manor with a porch whose floorboards were so rotted you could see the ground through the cracks, and 2 acres of woods out back. "Nobody's lived here since 1987, the realtor said, handing over the keys. He had that kind of voice people use to deliver a diagnosis. After the Wallace family, Jim didn't ask what happened to the Wallaces. He unpacked boxes, blasted country radio at full volume, and tried not to notice that the sound in the living room behaved strangely. When he stood by the fireplace, the music came from the right, but with one step, the source seemed to shift. At first, it was just the thumping that bothered him. The master bedroom on the 2nd floor was the largest, but he preferred to sleep in the small guest room overlooking the backyard. Because in the master bedroom, when night fell, a thumping came from the wall. Rhythmic. Slow. As if someone on the other side of the drywall was clapping their hands once every 3 seconds. Jim checked the attic empty. He checked the basement. It smelled of dampness and old paint, but there was no one there. Rodents, he told his reflection while brushing his teeth. Or pipes. On the 5th night, the clapping turned into knocking. Knock, knock, knock. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks. Like Morse code. Jim knocked back, just to drown it out. The knocking would stop for exactly 5 minutes, then start again. He hadn't slept in 3 days when he decided to take a walk to the local bar, Bill's Place. The bar was a rusty shack with pickups in the parking lot and people who wore their names on badges from the gas station. "You're the new one, from the Wallace house," said the bartender, a tall woman with a face carved by wrinkles like a map of backcountry roads. She set a glass of bourbon in front of him, though he hadn't ordered. "Here, you're owed this." "I don't follow." She leaned across the counter. She smelled of mint and something sweet, almost like formaldehyde. "Neighbors say the first week, everyone puts up with it. Then they start knocking back. Then they start talking to the wall. And then they open the door." "What door?" Jim asked, feeling a chill creep down his spine. "There's a door in the basement. Have you found it?" He nodded. There was indeed a door in the basement, locked with a padlock covered in green patina. Jim had assumed it was just a storage closet. "Don't open it," the bartender said, taking away the empty glass. "If you do open it, don't answer whatever it asks. And never, ever smile back." She disappeared into the back room, leaving him with a question hanging in the air like smoke. Jim didn't believe. He was a man of science, teaching drafting at the local college. His world had no room for ghosts or backwoods tall tales. But when he got home and went upstairs, he saw it for the first time. The door to the master bedroom was ajar. He distinctly remembered closing it that morning. More than that, he remembered checking the handle. It was stiff, sticking, because the frame had warped with age. Now the door stood open exactly 3 inches. Just enough space to slip a face through. Jim pushed it open with his shoulder. The room was empty. Old floral wallpaper, an empty curtain rod over the bed that had been left by the previous owners, a massive thing with carved posts. He walked around the room, running his hand over the wall where he'd heard the knocking at night. The drywall was ice cold. He went to sleep in the guest room, but at 3:15 a.m., he was jolted awake by a sound. Not knocking this time. It was singing. A woman's voice, high and clear as glass, hummed a melody he'd never heard. The words were indistinct, but the rhythm was like a lullaby. The voice came from the heating vent in the floor. Jim sat up in bed. His heart pounded somewhere in his throat, but he forced himself to stand. He dropped to his hands and knees and pressed his ear to the grate. The singing stopped. Silence lasted a minute. Then, from the vent, came a soft, clear whisper. "Can you hear me?" The voice was a child's. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8. Jim recoiled. He wanted to say something like "Who's there?" but his voice wouldn't obey. Instead, he heard something heavy being dragged across the floor downstairs. In the living room. He went down the stairs, gripping a crowbar. The living room was flooded with moonlight. He'd forgotten to close the curtains. And in that light, he saw that the rocking chair he'd placed by the window was slowly swaying. By itself. Creak. Forward. Back. Forward. The seat was empty. Jim ran out onto the porch. The night was cold, the sky clear, stars scattered like buckshot. He sat on the steps until dawn, smoking one cigarette after another, though he'd quit 5 years ago. He'd found the pack in his pickup's glove compartment. Marlboros, expired. At dawn, he went down to the basement. Sunlight filtered through the narrow windows near the ceiling, dissolving his fear. He stood before the door with the padlock. Old bricks, concrete floor, the smell of mold. He touched the lock. The metal was cold, but not rusty as if it had been installed yesterday. "This is stupid," he said aloud. His own voice sounded alien in the basement, with an echo that shouldn't have been there. He didn't open the door. Instead, he drove into town and bought deadbolts, security cameras, and motion sensors. He spent the day installing the system, feeling like the protagonist of a cheap horror movie. By evening, the house was rigged with electronics like a fortress. That night, he slept with a hammer under his pillow. The cameras caught nothing. The sensors never triggered. But at 3:15 a.m., the singing returned. Now it was louder, and Jim realized the voice wasn't coming from the vent. It was coming from behind the wall, from the master bedroom. He got up, walked down the hall, stopped before the door, which was once again ajar 3 inches. He went in. The room was empty, but the bed was made. He certainly hadn't done that. The sheets were pulled tight, corners tucked military style, and on the pillow lay a doll. An old rag doll with button eyes and a wide smile embroidered with red thread. He hadn't bought that doll. He'd never seen it before. Jim picked it up. It was heavy, disproportionately heavy for its size. He turned it over, and a photograph fell from its back. A Polaroid, faded to yellow. In the picture was a family. A man, a woman, and a little girl, about 7, with pigtails. They were smiling, all except the girl. She stared into the lens with wide eyes, and her mouth had been crossed out with black marker. On the back, written in ballpoint pen, "She doesn't smile. Never smiles." Jim dropped the photo. In the same instant, the doll jerked in his hand. It didn't fall, it gripped his fingers with its rag doll hands. The strength was inhuman. He screamed, slamming the doll against the wall, but it only held tighter. Finally, he threw it to the floor and stomped on it until stuffing burst from the fabric. The doll fell apart, but something gleamed among the sawdust and scraps. A small metal key. The key to the padlock in the basement. That night, Jim didn't go down to the basement. He sat in the kitchen with all the lights on, holding the key in his open palm, watching the clock's hands move slowly. At 3:15, the silence was broken not by knocking, nor by singing. It was a soft, clear laugh. It came from below, from the basement. Jim grabbed a flashlight, grabbed his hammer, and descended the stairs, each one creaking like a dying breath. The basement met him with cold. The lock on the door glinted in the flashlight beam. Jim inserted the key. He stepped through, whispering a prayer he hadn't spoken since he was 7. The door didn't open to a storage closet. Behind it was a room, an exact replica of the master bedroom upstairs. The same bed with carved posts, the same floral wallpaper. But everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the air held a smell that made Jim's stomach clench, sweet, cloying, like funeral flowers. On the bed sat a little girl, the same one from the photograph, in the same dress, with the same pigtails. She was still 7 years old, though the picture was nearly 40 years old. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching him with empty eyes. "Hello," she said. Her voice was not a child's. It held an ancient quality that didn't match the pigtails or the lace collar. Jim wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. He stood in the doorway, rooted. "You took a long time to come," the girl said. "I knocked. I called. But you didn't come. Who are you?" Jim managed. "I'm the one who lives here. I've always lived here. You all come and go, but nobody stays. Because I ask them to stay, and they don't want to." She smiled. The smile was wrong. It stretched to wide, beyond the limits of a human face, and in the darkness of her mouth, Jim saw not teeth, but rows of small, sharp needles like shards of glass. "Smile at me," she said. "Smile, and we'll be together," the bartender had said. "Never smile back." Jim backed away. He did not smile. He stared at the girl, and every instinct screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to close the door. Slowly, without looking away from that smile, which no longer fit on her face, spreading across her cheeks, her forehead, turning the child's face into a mask of pure, primal horror. The lock clicked shut. Jim went upstairs, locked the basement door, boarded it up with planks, and called the realtor the next morning. "I'm moving out," he said. "Today. I understand," The realtor replied, without a trace of surprise. "I'll send some movers." "And, Mr. Harper?" "Yes. If she asks why you're leaving, don't apologize. She takes apologies as agreement." Jim hung up. He packed his things in an hour. When the last box was loaded into his pickup, he walked through the house to make sure he hadn't forgotten anything. In the living room, the rocking chair swayed again. In the kitchen, the stove was burning, though he hadn't lit it. And in the hallway, hanging from the umbrella stand, was that same rag doll. New, intact, buttons for eyes. It stared at him, and it was smiling. Jim ran out of the house, leaving the door open. He got in his truck and started the engine. As he pulled onto the highway, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood on the hill, surrounded by autumn forest. And in every window on the second floor, in every bedroom, a light was on. He hadn't left any lights on. He pressed the gas and didn't look back until Lancaster disappeared around the bend. Jim bought a new place in a neighboring state, Ohio. An apartment in a multi-story building, no basement, no attic, neighbors behind every wall. He changed jobs, changed his phone number, and stopped drinking coffee after 6 so he wouldn't wake up at 3:15. For 6 months, he lived in silence. He started to forget. It felt like the nightmare had stayed behind in that house, locked in the basement with the girl who never grew up. But last night, he woke up at exactly 3:15. The apartment was dark, but the bedroom door was ajar 3 inches. He distinctly remembered closing it. He didn't get up. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the paralysis of fear to pass. And then he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind. But the wind can't form words. "Jim," a voice called. The same one, childlike, but ancient. He squeezed his eyes shut, clenched his fists. "Don't answer. Don't smile. Don't open the door. Did you forget me, Jim?" The voice was closer now, as if she was standing in the hallway, just beyond the door. "I haven't forgotten you. You opened the door, Jim. You came into my room. You looked at me." The floorboards creaked. Slow, heavy, though the girl couldn't weigh more than 40 pounds. "You didn't smile at me then. That was rude." The door began to open, slowly, inch by inch. The hinges didn't squeak. Jim had oiled them a month ago, but the door was opening by itself. He opened his eyes. In the gap between the door and the frame, it was dark. But in that darkness, something was white. A face. A pale, round face with empty eyes and a mouth positioned exactly where a smile should be. But there was no smile. There was a black void. "Smile at me, Jim," she whispered. "Just smile." He felt his lips begin to tremble. The corners of his mouth began to rise involuntarily. Not from joy, from pure, animal terror that twists the face into a grimace resembling a smile. He bit his lip until it bled. He clenched his jaw with all his strength, feeling the muscles of his face seize. "No," he rasped. "Please. Do you want to say no?" The voice suddenly sounded hurt, utterly childlike. "But you came. You opened the door. You took the key. You wanted to see me. Everyone wants to see me. And then no one wants to smile." The face in the gap began to change. The skin stretched, the eyes widened, and the mouth, that black mouth, began to stretch sideways, exposing rows of needles. The smile spread beyond the face, flowing across the doorframe, across the wall, across the ceiling, like ink in water. "Smile," she said, no longer in a voice, but in a vibration that traveled through the walls, through the floor, through his bones. Jim screamed. He screamed until he lost his voice. The neighbors pounded on the wall and called the police. When the cops arrived, they found him curled in the corner of the bedroom, his lips bloody and his eyes wide open. "Mr. Harper, are you all right?" an officer asked. Jim looked up at him. He wanted to say, "No, I'm not. She's here. She's in the walls. She's in the vents. She's waiting for me to smile." But he said nothing, because, looking at the officer's reflection in the wardrobe mirror, he saw what stood behind him. A little girl in a lace dress, with empty eyes. And she was smiling. Now, Jim Harper is a patient in the Columbia County Psychiatric Hospital. He doesn't speak, doesn't look in mirrors, and sleeps with his mouth taped shut. His medical chart reads catatonic syndrome due to acute stress disorder. But the orderlies say that at night, exactly at 3:15, he starts to laugh. A soft, high, childlike laugh. And when they enter the room, he sits on the bed, his hands folded in his lap, staring at them with empty eyes. On his lips plays a smile, too wide, too perfect, a smile that was never his own. If you wake up at night and think there's someone in the room, do not check. Do not open the door. And for God's sake, do not smile into the darkness. She always smiles first.